I'm Shantanu. We'll talk about the QtQuick Designer and how to use it for desktop applications, at least how I have used it in the past. So a little bit about myself. I work as a software engineer at KDAB, and I've been contributing to KDE since 2009. Started with random patches to Plasma here and there, and then contributed to a couple of more projects. And I also mentored in season of KDE and Google Summer of Code. So I'll be very happy if some of my students are actually watching this right now. Thank you. And I really love working on desktop software. Like since I got into programming early days with C, after that, when I discovered Visual Basic, for whatever it was back then, I fell in love with how awesome it felt to write desktop apps. So thankfully, I found Qt later on, and it changed my life forever. So yep, desktop apps are fun. Let's go. Before we go to the crux of the matter, which is the QtQuick Designer, let's do a quick refresher on QML and QtQuick. There have been talks on that in desktop days and also Academy, but this is just in case if there are things people left out, or for folks who have not watched those talks before and are joining us today. I'll just do a quick refresher. So moving to the next slide. So there are two things here, QtQuick and QML. So QML is a language that essentially lets you describe your UI in a declarative form. What that means is you don't program that, hey, create a button and add it here and then create one more button and move it below that. No, you just say that I want two buttons, one here and one below that, and after that, the QML scene render and everything will do it for you. So that's QML. And QtQuick is a collection of tools that help you use QML to build out user interfaces. So you have visual elements at the rectangle, buttons, and then you have user interaction things like mouse area, which lets you handle clicks and drags and everything. You also have states and transitions. So what that means is your UI can be in different states when the user is working with that. So you might have a home screen, you might have the edit screen, and then you might have maybe uploading a file state. So you can define those states and then also define transitions that essentially can do animations to give a smooth flow between these two things. And transitions can contain something called animations in QML. So you can animate opacity, color, anchors, and whatnot. Then you have the model view classes, which essentially let you present information. So if you have worked with Qt before, pretty much everything, all information is in models. You have a list view and grid view that lets you essentially display this information to the user in some manner. And there are, just for mention, there are particle and graphical effects. I have not used particle effects. I just enjoyed watching the examples because they do fun things. But graphical effects are pretty useful. Like if you use shadows properly in your UI, you can actually make a big deal of a difference. I'll show a small example in today's thing if Murphy is with me. So this is the basic thing. QML is a language. QtQuick is a set of tools that help you make interfaces. Next. So as Jesper was saying in the introduction, that it's not a very famous thing or not very popular to make desktop applications with QML. So, and there's a reason for that. It's just like pretty much everything in software engineering, nothing is a silver bullet. There are downsides to everything, there are advantages to everything. So you need to figure out what works best for you. So I listed few things that you can essentially think about and you can plan before you start making your applications to take a call on should you use QML and QtQuick or should you use widgets. So the first thing is, I put it in quotes, UI complexity. Again, it's not like algorithmic complexity, something that you can define. You will need to sit down with your teammates, maybe your design person and your product guy, and figure out what exactly do you want in your application? What options will the user see? What is the workflow? So the first thing is, if you can say density, essentially how many UI elements do you have? Do you have, let's say, a central place where you are showing something important to the user? Then there are some interaction tools at the bottom. So that does not sound, for example, the screen that you're looking at right now watching this talk is not too complex. I mean, it does something really complex in the background, but the UI itself is pretty simple. You have like 2 to 3 options, maybe 6 options if you're the speaker, but that's pretty much it. Compare that to, let's say, a big application like a spreadsheet, or maybe even a word processor, or something I work on at KDAB, which is called QI-Tissue. It's a tool used for cancer research, and it shows thousands and sometimes even millions of cells inside tissues. So I'm not saying that QML cannot render that, but these are sort of things that you need to keep in mind to get an idea of how hard or how easy it might be for you to use QML. As a general thumb rule, for simpler stuff, QML works fine and is actually more productive. And for something which is quite dense, widgets works better. Again, there's no one true answer. It's almost like Vim and Emacs. You can keep fighting at that. And the second thing is component availability. So what that means is you will obviously have a rough idea on what your application will need to use. Will you just have some buttons and text fields and some animations, maybe images? That's something really simple. And QML and QtQuick already have a lot of components to do all of that. There are also modules in the Qt marketplace that let you do more things. But for example, there will be times where you already know that you need something from Qt widgets. For example, there's a very nice plotting library called QCustomPlot that does not have QML support, at least that one that I know of. So if that's, let's say, a deal breaker for you, then maybe you should stick with widgets, and maybe QML, it's not yet time for you to use QML. Maybe someone will port it. For example, if you're going to use KDAB widgets, Sergio will have it ported to QML pretty soon, so that's not going to be a problem. Then comes styling. Again, there's no clear difference, but there are more or less these two kind of applications. One of them, which I personally like, is ones that look consistent with your desktop. If you're using them on Mac OS, it feels like you're using a Mac OS application. If you're using it on Windows, it feels like that. So if you need native, like near 100% native look and feel, again, widgets is something that shines doing that right now, and QML does not really do very well. But if you have watched the keynote in desktop days, there is something coming in Qt 6 which might actually make it better. Personally, I've not looked at it yet. I was excited. I didn't know about it before the talk, so I'm going to do that. But right now, if you want completely native feel, then probably widgets is better for you. And on the other side, a lot of applications need one complete custom branding. Like your product team does not really care about desktop consistency anymore, although they should. If you have such an application that will look the same everywhere, no matter which platform you do it for, then QML will be absolutely easy for you to get it right. You can style widgets also, but I found that styling QML was much easier for my usage. And then there's the nature of the design team. What I mean with that from that is, if you work closely, like one of the modes that developers operate in is we get a mockup, and we look at the mockup, get an idea of what the user wants to see, and we build that out using code, let's say in widgets and whatnot. Sometimes you'll also have a design person or design team working with you on your application. So if that is the case, then using QML helps you a lot. But this is something that happened in my last job, where we actually started a completely new product from scratch, and we had a design team from day one, and they wanted it to look exactly like they want. And QML made it much easier for me to work. I'll explain how in the presentation, but that's something that again lets you make that call. And one of the other thing is the availability of acceleration. QML will, at least right now in 5, it relies on OpenGL for rendering, RHI in Qt 6, but generally QML will not work that well if you use software rendering, for example. So if you feel that your users might actually not have GPU acceleration, then maybe that's another thing that makes a QML a no for you. So these are the broad things. There are more considerations, but this is broadly what I have found out in my experience. So another quick thing, I know you are still waiting for me to get to the QtQuick designer. I'll get there. Be patient. This is something that no one else covered in their talk, so I thought I'll show you. These are few pics of applications that use QML, and I find them to be pretty nice. The first one is something that I always found it to be very beautiful. If you have played games like Diablo or StarCraft, you would have seen this. This is Blizzard's Battle.net app where you can install their games and launch them and whatnot, talk to your friends. So this is completely done in QML, and a screenshot does not do justice. You have to actually try it out to see how smooth the user interaction is. They got pretty much everything right. The way their controls are themed, and it's just good. They sometimes get the spelling wrong. Somehow patch notes becomes packed notes, but probably there was a Klingon doing that. So that's one. Some self-promotion here. This is So Strong, the product I worked on my last job. It is developed by a small company in Bangalore, India, which a lot of people use for Counter-Strike tournaments in Asia. So this is what I worked on from the ground up, and QML has been very helpful here. Like I can imagine it being difficult if I was using widgets for this. So this is So Strong, and then you have Ultimaker Cura, which is I have not used this personally, but I found this that it uses QML and it's there for 3D printing. So interesting stuff. And then we have Scryte. On Monday, there was a talk by Prashant on Scryte. If you have not watched that, there will be a video available. Please go and watch that, because Prashant actually, Scryte actually, I think takes QML to its limits. Well, not limits, but pushes it through the boundaries, I would say, when it comes to desktop applications. I was very impressed when I saw Scryte for the first time, and that QML could actually do all this. So do watch the talk on Scryte. Then I think there's the last one is Discover. This is if you have used KDE, this is the software center, and from what I understand, it's built with QML as well, using a framework called Kirigami. So in this case, actually on KDE, the Kirigami framework makes the app look completely native, so that there's the QML problem of things not looking native doesn't happen here. So let's move on. And another thing that I figured is a lot of apprehension about developing desktop applications with QML is because there's not a lot of prior art on that. Like people are confused on how should I structure my application. A lot of tutorials will talk about how to do that in widgets, but not that many for when it comes to QML. So these are again some ideas I put together based on my learnings working on So Strong for the last 5 years, and let's see if that helps you when you start your QML project. So first is the code base structure. Try to keep your UI assets like the QML, JavaScript files, and the design assets with Qt's resource system. Those QRC files that you use. It just makes it simpler that you don't have to think about deployment and where should the files go. It just works out of the box. And the second point here is generally applied to Qt anyway, but QML actually forces you to do that, is always have your data models and business logic in C++. You can put business logic in QML if you are in a hurry and you have to show let's say a POC in 5 minutes or an hour. That's fine, but on the long term for performance, you should keep business logic in C++. Another cool thing that I did for So Strong was you can keep your code organized in folders. For example, you can keep common things in one and then have multiple form factors in their own separate components, so to speak. So desktop can contain your desktop application with UI that is completely suited to the desktop. Mobile can contain something which is smaller. Maybe another thing you can have is a tablet, and maybe Bluescape, the presentation from yesterday, can have another thing called a wall, which is very big. So this is another advantage of the second point, which is if you keep your business logic in C++, you can easily build out alternatives for different form factors while they can still use the same logic. This worked out pretty well again. Then is managing QML imports, because all of us are familiar with how C++ includes work, but not that much with imports. So what usually helped me is keeping one main resource, Qt resource, which with all the top level stuff like your home screen, your mains, your let's say your settings screen and all that, and then keep another imports directory which contains all of your reusable components. Like if you have views and controls, or you're using third-party stuff, like there's a nice library called QML utils from GitHub that you can use that. It also helps if you keep a resource file for each import, because then you can actually manage them separately and even reuse them in a different project. And use Qt's file selectors where appropriate. So Qt has this nice thing where you can provide a different QML file for a different, let's say, platform. So you can have button.qml and button_android.qml. So maybe you should not do that for buttons, but you get the general idea. So this also helps, although not that much, but it is pretty useful. And the other thing is assets. So when I was working with the design team, I actually wanted to make them self-sufficient, so they can make small tweaks to the UI without having to rely on the dev team, and that just fixes makes the feedback cycle better. So they were a bit confused that they to add and replace the image, to add a new image, they have to add the file and then add it to the resource, and then sort of understand like why does it take so many steps. So one cool thing you can do in your project file is you can say you can use this resources format to actually pick files automatically from your images and your sound folders. So this works out very convenient, again, if you're working with let's say a team who does not want to put too much effort into managing resources for you. And then imports, using namespaces is a good idea, especially for your own imports, because there's less headache that your types will conflict with something. So and something that happened to me was I had this thing called remote object like a few years back, and then Qt introduced its own remote object library, and that started conflicting. So, well, it did not for me because I was using namespaces already, but that's a good idea usually. And another thing that helps is defining singletons in QML. You can also do that with C++, but you can define your themes via singletons. So that's very useful. You can have consistent font colors, you can have consistent font sizes, which is really nice to build out a consistent UI. So that's that. Now, before also you go to designer, there are basic UI building blocks which are useful. Basic elements like the item, rectangle, and mouse area. These are very simple and also very low resource usage. They just let you draw rectangles and circles and all that stuff. There are views, which I've already talked about, list view and grid view. Loader and repeater let you dynamically load things. Again, if you have watched the Stride demo talk, you know what I'm talking about. But the quickest way to explain this is loader lets you defer loading, let's say your scenes, or if you have 30 screens in your application, you don't want to load all 30 at startup, right? So that's what loader does. And repeater essentially lets you create things on the fly using data from a model. So if you have a model which, let's say, has a list of fruits, you can actually create fruits on your canvas and animate them around. Then you have Qt controls 2, which contains basic UI elements like button, checkboxes, and combo box, radio button, and everything that you are used to. And then you have QtQuick layouts, which essentially help you lay out your UI essentially in grids and lists and rows and whatnot. So these basic things, right? Now, even if no matter if you're using writing QML code by hand or you're using the designer, these are some basic things that you need to know about when it comes to arranging UI elements. There are roughly three ways of doing this. For more details, you can actually watch the QML videos that we have on the KDAB channel. Jesper has done some nice videos on which explain all of these in detail on how you can do anchors and layouts. But I'll do a quick overview. Raw geometry essentially lets you provide hard-coded X, Y, and height and width, and essentially you want a rectangle which is 50 by 50 at 10 by 10 pixels. So that's something easy to do. It's also very easy to animate because the animations just take a from and to, and you can just move boxes around and whatnot. But the problem is it's not very responsive. If a user is resizing things, you have to do funky math to get that working. Then another cool thing in QML is anchors. It's essentially relative positioning, where you can say, I want this button to be here, and then I want this button to be anchored next to it with a margin of 20. So these two buttons can actually move together. So that's very useful, and much better than raw geometry when it comes to responsiveness, because if you do resizes, they'll actually take that into account. It's slightly harder to animate because you can animate it. If you write a number animation and apply it to, let's say, an anchor margin, it'll work fine. But it is pretty inefficient because anchors are slightly complex to calculate than plain XY values. So if you really want to animate something in anchors, you should do something like break your anchors for a moment before you animate, then animate according to the raw geometry and get the anchors back. So it takes some practice to animate that. Then you have QtQuick layouts. These are very similar to the layouts you have in widgets, where you can essentially have things laid out in a row or in a column or in a grid. So these also are very responsive because you can essentially define constraints, and let's say if your window is resizing, everything will adjust according to your constraints. So just give it the right min, max, and preferred size, and you're all good. Layouts also has the same thing as anchors. It's very difficult to animate. You can animate as anchors. You can just, let's say, animate layout or preferred width, but it's again going to be very computationally intensive. If you actually try it in an application, you'll see any medium complexity app will actually, you see it doing artifacts when you're resizing. It'll be slow. So if there are parts of your UI that you want to animate, sometimes raw geometry works better, but usually a combination of anchors and layouts are pretty useful. Right, and then we have styling QtQuick controls, which essentially is something you'll need to do if you have custom theming need to be applied on controls. You can use one of the inbuilt styles, default, fusion, and material. Default is a very plain, I think, very less resource consumption, and fusion makes its best attempt to look similar to your native styles. Doesn't do that very well, but then that's what we have. Material is a custom implementation of the Android thing that kind of works. You can customize the styles via code. There are examples in the documentation on how to do that. You can create your own button.qml, checkbox.qml to achieve that. Or you can provide design assets. So this is something that my design team really liked in my previous job, where they essentially give you the PNG files generated from Photoshop. They have to follow the 9 patch image guidelines, but at the end, once the hard work is done, the UI ends up looking very similar to what they had in mind. So that makes the developer's job easier as well. Each state, for example, you can supply multiple files for button pressed, button checked, and it'll just work. Things like progress bar actually takes animations from WebP files, so that works fine. So these are the broad ways you can style. Again, the method you pick depends on what team do you have. Do you have a design team, or the way you need to style it? This is something you can experiment in just a couple of hours, so take a look at that. Right, so finally, with all that QML context set in the way, sorry for making you wait this long, we can move to the designer. I'll just take a quick water break. Right. So what is the designer? It's not designer the person who sits with you, but the designer, a tool that is built into Qt Creator. If you have worked with widgets before, we also have Qt Designer there, which lets you something very similar. And the advantage here is that you get a live preview while you're working on the UI. So if you see the screenshot, you have a central area with the preview of your UI. You have different states at the bottom. And you can also open a split view with now a docked widget, where you can actually edit the code real time and see how it looks. Now, this is where a lot of people get their love and hate relationship with Qt Designer, and some people actually get the hate relationship. Is the workflow really varies here. it's not it's given all the good things it has and everything, it's not perfect for every use case. So for example, something that I find it to be very useful for is the initial layout. What that means is, let's say you have a mock-up from your designer that, okay, this is how your UI should look. This is the, let's say, a vertical area, and this has some buttons. This is an image preview. So doing the initial layouts actually becomes much more productive, and I would say even fun, because if you have a live preview working with you. Obviously, you can achieve that without the designer as well. There are ways to do live reloads of QML there, that you can use. But the designer actually, sometimes I find that the WYSIWYG and drag and drop way of doing things are simpler when it comes to the initial layout. I have recorded a small video which I'll play at the end if I get time. Essentially shows you how it looks to build a small UI. So initial layout is something I can say without a doubt that it makes it very easy. There's not much problem there. The other thing that a designer really helps is, as I talked before, that if you're developing with a design team, it actually makes the process very easy, because you can literally have the person sit next to you and do it, or maybe you can share your screen and you can work on those small tweaks which you need. If you have ever heard Nuno, who's a designer from KDAB, or any of his talks or workshops, you know that the final 80% of the job actually is in the last 10% of the polish. So that polish is very, again, in some cases, I will not say in all, but it's very efficient to do it with a designer, with a person sitting next to you. And then the last thing is previewing state. So this is something I actually have a live example today, and I'll explain how that works. But essentially, there are times when you don't want the whole workflow, that if there is a state in which the user goes after clicking 5 buttons, if you make a change to that, you run your application, then you click the 5 buttons, and then see, oh shit, I fucked up the margin. So what do I do? So then you go back to your code again, you fix up the margin, then you run the application again, click the 5 buttons, go to that state. There are ways to do that, but in Designer, it makes it, again, easy. You can just click the 5th state, go there and edit the code and see how it's going to look. So that's just very easy to do. An example from SoStrong, the game app that I showed you before, is sometimes people get bans because they were caught cheating. Now, not everybody will get a ban, probably a 1 user in 1,000. And you might forget testing this every time you make a change. And running the application, then going to the backend, banning your player, coming back to the app and checking how it looks is a lengthy process. You don't want to do that. You could just go to the ban state and then see how it looks. And that's just makes it much easier. There are design restrictions with what you can do with a designer. I'll explain that more in the coming slide, but that's essentially one of the things that doesn't make it a universal tool. You need to decide on where you want to use a designer and where you don't. In most real-world applications, you will have a mix of these. You will not use a designer for all of your screens, only some of them. So today's demo application is a simple music player. It doesn't do anything fancy. It opens up and shows you a list of music files that you can essentially click and start playing. So I'll quickly share my screen, and if Murphy allows, show you how that looks. Okay, so we'll go here, run the app. And this is the basic screen. There's a list of songs, and this is essentially a grid view, the one that I was talking about in my previous presentation, in my previous slide. You can essentially click one of those songs and it starts playing. So that's it. Nothing fancy. And there's a playlist which I haven't implemented, so it's blank. But there are these 3 tabs. And remember this screen, because I will talk about that in the next few slides. Remember that when you hover on these song tiles, it essentially shows you the names of the files. And then once you click one of them, it actually starts playing. So remember this screen and remember the library. So I'll stop sharing now. Right. Back to the slide. Simple music application, 2 screens, one that shows you a list of grid of all your songs in a particular folder, and the second one actually shows you what music is playing right now. So let's talk about what components do I have in this simple application. If you look at the left side, is a media library, the first thing that you see. And this screenshot is from the Qt Designer. So it's working with just mock data. So you just see the same image on all of them. The media library is a grid view. And on the bottom, you have this thing called the media library delegate. If you don't know what this means, again, you can find this in Qt's documentation and also Prashant's talk about Sprite. So a delegate, essentially, you can think of it as copy pasting the delegates every time there's an item in the grid view. So that's how it works. The delegate shows you a cover art of the song and also the title of the song on the bottom. On the right side, you have the currently playing media. On the left side, in that you show a cover art, and on the right side we show some details about the song, the album artist, the name of the song, the bitrate, and whatnot. On the right, on the bottom it shows you the component, the media info. This thing essentially gets shown here in the now current media screen. So the reason I am showing the delegate and the media info separately is these two things are essentially done in the designer, even these two. So we'll show how these are done. Let me clear. So before I'll go to this slide again. The way you use a designer is you'll have two files. One of them is a design file, which you will edit in the designer. You drag things around and edit properties. And the second is the implementation file. So that's what the next slide is about. This is the implementation file, and this is the design file. So let's see what they are doing. If you focus your attention on this one, what you'll see is it essentially has an item. An item in QML is nothing but just a thing that holds all the children together. There's no visual hint to it. It doesn't look like anything. It's invisible, if you can think about it like that. And it has some UI elements. For example, the one that is showing the cover art, and there's another one which is showing essentially the song details on the right side. So let's say this media info is the song details. It will show you what is sorry, this is the thing on the left side, which shows you the cover art. And let me go back to the previous slide. This is what I'm talking about. It shows the cover art and also the name of the song that is playing and the artist image. So this media info is what is responsible for displaying that information. Now, the problem is, while you're working in the designer, you don't really know the data. That's available only when you run the app. So what you do is you essentially put some fake stuff into it. You say, hi, this is the song name, this is the album artist. And then what you do is if you notice this, the ID of this element is also shown here. So what we are doing here is we are making media info available outside this design file. So what you can do is parts of your design can be exported or made available to the outside world, and they can be set values from outside then. So if you look at the implementation file now, what this does is it instantiates the media design. So this way, when you load the current media.qml, it's actually going to show you all the UI from current media design. Then we have the media player, which is part of Qt Multimedia. You essentially throw a music file at it and it'll start playing it. So that's as simple as it gets, well, when it works. And then what you do is, using this media info thing that you have exported as an alias, you say media info, which references this guy, and title, which is a text field, and then you set its text property to player.metadata.title. So you get the metadata from this guy and essentially put it here. And there are a lot of arrows. So essentially, that's the general idea about using the designer. And you start with giving it mock values so that you can preview how the UI looks. And then in your implementation file, you can add real data. You can give it your real model. You can fetch data from a file system or from the network, wherever you want. So this is one part. And I'll show a quick demo on how to add the alias via the designer. Just to recap again, the alias is this way of exporting design elements to the outside world to use the implementation file. So let's share the screen again. Please, Murphy. Right. Okay. So I will go to current media design. We will switch to the design mode. Right. So if you see, oh, not this is not the one I wanted to go. What I want to go to is media info design, and then go to the design mode. So this is one. This is showing the cover art for one music file, and then the title and artist and the album artist for that. So what you can do is essentially after you have put everything together, you can click the element that you want to be available outside. And on the left side in the navigator, you can essentially toggle this button. So right now it's showing red color, which essentially means that it is exported to the outside world. If you click it again, it toggles away. I'll scroll up in the text area. So keep looking at this place and see what happens when I toggle. You see, every time that I toggle, it actually creates the alias, and if I turn it off, it removes the alias. So using the navigator on the left side, you can actually easily export things that you want to be controlled from outside. This is very useful. You don't need to export everything, so that you essentially have some sort of encapsulation and everything just works fine. Going back to the presentation. So that was a small demo on how you can do aliases. Let me quickly check on time. Okay, right. So then we have user interaction. If you remember, if you select a song, it actually starts playing. And it also moves to the second screen where it shows you the information, the cover art, and the metadata about the music. So how does that work? That's the second thing. Now you know how to set properties from outside. What about signals? So now we have library design, which essentially is the design file for the media library. It contains a grid view, and there's a delegate inside. Remember, the delegate is something that is essentially repeated for each item in the model. So what I have here is it uses something called item delegate, which is part of QtQuick controls. It gives you a lot of things for free. For example, it will theme you according to the current QtQuick controls theme. And it also has a few signals like clicked and hover, and which you can use to handle user interaction. So what I do here is I create something called connections. I say the target is delegate root, this guy. And then I say whenever you are clicked, okay, let me undo that. Whenever you are clicked, you say root.media selected file URL. So what that does is there's no emit keyword in QML. You just simply call it as a function and it works. So it will emit this signal of the root element called media selected and pass the file URL. This file URL comes from the model. It's one of the roles. So going to the implementation file now, I have skipped the library.qml because it doesn't have anything. It simply includes a design file. I use the library in main.qml, and I handle this signal here. So the QML syntax for handling signals is you say on, and this is one of the implicit parts that I find dark magic and don't really like, but then it's how it is. You say on the signal name, and then you put the code. So essentially what I do here is I set the current media source to the URL. The URL is the parameter passed here. And then I say swipe view.current index equal to 1. So that will transition to view to the second tab, so to speak. So this is how you use user interaction. Notice that I could have directly said on clicked. This line could have been here. But that is something that a designer doesn't support. You need to use the connection element and then emit signals from there. So that I'll have a slide about what all you cannot do in the designer, but this is something you can do. So two patterns that you need to remember when you're working with a designer is how do you expose properties so that they can be set from outside, and how do you emit signals and generally handle user interaction. So the final thing that I want to discuss is using the designer to preview states. This is something I found very useful, as I have described in the slides before this. It is useful to preview states without actually running the app. Not just because of these two things which let you preview. There's also a live preview button inside a designer which will launch a window which will refresh as you're typing your code. States are listed at the bottom, and you can define only one set of states per design file. So although QML allows you to have states per item, the designer will not let you do that. You need to have one set of states for each design file. The way this is helpful is, think of this example where, let's say we have our media player application working fine, everybody is using it, but now people want this feature because the world is connected, that I want to see what my friend is listening to, and I want to invite my friend and listen to the music that I am listening to, and sort of do a party of things. The problem there is, okay, let's say you figured out how to implement it using networks and web and sockets and whatnot. The way it'll work, if you run the application, is you launch the app, you open something like a friends list, and you invite your friend to join a party with you, and a listening party or something. And your friend joins, and then you guys can see each what the other person is listening to. Imagine testing this. Imagine having to run the app, then another app, inviting the second user from the first app, joining it, and then doing all of this. And this is not a made-up example. This is exactly what I had to do in SoStrong, because that was a game between 10 players. So there was times when, to test a 2v2 game, I had to launch 4 applications to see what the UI will look at in this state. And that's still useful to see the whole flow. There's no way to test that otherwise. But when you're making small changes, like if your designer wants that, hey, you make this button text bold, you don't want to do all that again and figure out that, oh shit, you used the wrong property, you set the bold thing, and you have to do everything again. You can simply go to the right state and see how it looks. So I'll see the next slide. So this is not implemented in the example, but this is how it will look. Let's say this is me, and I've invited another of my friend to listen to with me. And if you see, the second state is selected. So you can already preview on how the second state looks. For example, you suddenly have a separator now. You did not have that separator before. If you see this slide, there was no separator. And this thing vanished as well, because we chose that it's not necessary anymore when you already have these 2 things. So this is very useful as well when you're working on like medium complexity applications which have these dynamic requirements. Right. Quick break again. So some small tips: avoid using hard-coded dimensions when you're developing for the desktop, especially. I have this point in here. It's common knowledge, but the reason I have this point here is, if you look for videos on using the QtQuick designer, even the ones officially from the Qt channel, you will find them using hard-coded dimensions all the time, because a lot of those videos are working with fixed form factors in mind. For example, embedded devices, where you're going to be rendering at 333 into 170 and whatnot. But that's not the case on the desktop. So don't try to avoid those things when you're using the designer, and generally in QML as well. As I discussed earlier, you can just create a theme singleton and have things like small, medium size, and large size, and all that. And designer has no problem with that. As long as you don't call a function, everything is fine. You can use properties and all that. Then QtQuick controls 2 lets you set the styles via environment variable. You can also set it from code, and you can also set it from this file called QtQuickControls2.conf. Now, if you set it via the code or the environment variable, that means the design changes, the styling will only take in effect after you run the application. What that means is your designer preview will look very different. It will still be the same layout, but it'll look very different from the real application. And that kind of diminishes the whole effect. So instead, if you use the configuration file to specify which theme you want to use, let's say Material or Imagine, the designer actually reads this file and adjusts everything so it looks as near as it can to your real application. And finally, use test data to help preview. So let's say in the music player application, the designer won't let you do a file system browse to see how many music files you have. So what you can do is you can create a list model of mock data and give it to the designer, and it will happily display the view with that model in case. So then you can have a fully featured UI and a fully featured preview without having to run the app. And what you do at runtime is, from the implementation file, you actually provided the real model, and everything will just work fine. You can also use a JavaScript array instead of a list model. So that works if if you're getting data from a web service. You can call the API, copy that JSON if it returns JSON, and you can just copy that directly into a JavaScript file and give it to the designer. Now we have limitations. For example, as I said in the last slide, you cannot call functions. So for example, if in your theme file, singleton, you have a function which tells you where your theme images are located. And if that is called a function called image, and you pass it the image file, you'll not be able to do that in Designer. So what you should do instead is have a variable called image prefix, which contains the path, and you just append the file name to it. So these small things you need to take care of because of these restrictions that you cannot have JavaScript expressions and you cannot call functions. Single line JS expressions are allowed. Just that a block is not allowed. I don't know the internal implementation or why that is the case. Probably I'll look at it one day. Then there are QML elements like a transition timer, which is not supported in the Designer as well, because probably it will not have any idea what to do. I am told that a future version of the Designer actually might have it. So let's see. And there are quirks using few things like the repeater. So this is the funniest thing I've seen in Designer till now, which is I noticed that the Designer would suddenly start crashing after a while after I worked on my UI. Over a few weeks, I figured that it was actually repeater which was confusing the hell out of it. And if I use the delegate, explicitly saying delegate : and give it a delegate, it crashes. But if I remove the delegate, it works. In QML, it works because delegate is a default property, but I have no idea why that confuses the Designer. So there are these small quirks that you will discover while working on it. But again, you have to weigh on how useful the Designer is for you and probably pay these small prices. So that's that. That was the Designer. And as I said before, there is no silver bullet. At least the Designer is not one, but it is useful nevertheless. The way I used it is there are screens where I found the concept of states and the ability to preview them without running the application very useful. So for those essentially screens of the application, I used the Designer. And then there were parts of the application which was very heavy on animation and very heavy on doing some voodoo magic to do positioning. That will confuse the Designer like hell. So that's something that you want to use plain QML for. Don't try to use design files. So have this separation. At the end, I guess on SoStrong, I had around 30% of my UI done in Designer, and everything else maybe without using, or maybe it was around 40 or 50, I think. So make that call depending on what UI you are working on at that point. That I think you can summarize my presentation on that one sentence, that everything depends. So yeah, there's some more tooling that really helps when you're developing with QML in general. This has nothing to do with QtQuick, the Designer, but let's see, take a look at them anyway. Something underappreciated is the QML debugger. Even I found it quite late in my development. Like when I started using QML for a couple of months, I did not know about this. I just didn't imagine that you could put breakpoints in JavaScript. And this is very useful because sometimes you screw up your bindings and you'll have absolutely no idea on what's going wrong, or you'll have some JavaScript expression which is not doing what it is supposed to do, not like it does usually. It's JavaScript. But it's useful anyway. You can put a debug breakpoint here, and then you have the usual things that you can have from a debugger. It will show you all the local variables, and you also have a debugger console where you can print things. And it's just like if you have done web development, this is essentially similar to the console tab in developer tools. And finally, there is KDAB's gamma ray, which is again extremely useful when doing QtSAP in general. I'm not going to show a demo because I don't think I have time. Plus, people have already talked about this in talks. I'll quickly tell you, this screen essentially is the inspect element. If you are a web developer, you know what that does. You can essentially see what your UI is composed of, and it shows you all the properties. You can even change the properties from here, and it will show you these nifty warnings here that, okay, you have an item but it's outside the boundary but it's still visible, so maybe you should optimize, or maybe that's not what you wanted. So if you are working on an application and that button is just not showing up no matter what you are doing, maybe you screwed up a state somewhere or binding somewhere, gamma ray can be useful to find that for you. Then you have the models section where you can get a list of all the models and see what data they contain. This is also extremely useful to figure out if your model itself is not giving you the right data, or is it your delegate that is not interpreting it properly. And another thing that I found useful was the signals and slots. It's the signals tool, which essentially will show you a list of all objects and show a timeline of which signals are getting emitted. This is also useful on debugging what exactly is going inside your Qt application. So that's Gamma Ray. If you decide working on a QM application with QML, you should take a look at Gamma Ray for sure. It's going to make your life very easy. So that's it. I hope that you find the presentation useful, and I guess we can take questions now.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start out by saying that I'm truly amazed about your drawing skills.
Yes, and I'm impressed that Blickboo button can do it very well. Yes.
So, few questions. We have the first one here. You talked about different assets for different setups, and Andre is asking, do you use file selector for that?
I did use file selector for some of them. Actually, no. For assets, I did not do that. What I did was essentially symlink the images into, let's say I have a common folder which has all the themes with the image assets, and I would just symlink them into mobile. Probably using asset selector is a good idea as well. Yep.
Okay. And I have a question here that says, I have a question. So that's a good start, you can say. I'm trying to do a complex system, have so many pages, also have to use OpenGL in it, and I want it on QML QtQuick. Is that a bad idea?
I'm not very sure on what you mean by have to use OpenGL. I'm assuming maybe you will render custom OpenGL in that. I actually have done that in the past, so I don't think it's a bad idea. Your mileage will depend. I'll quickly tell you what I used it for. A designer essentially gave me a video to show an animation inside the QML UI, and it was green screen. And this is something we have to do for a customer, for a POC, a B2B customer. So you can actually run your OpenGL code inside this thing, the graphical effects, and let's say remove the green screen and put a transparency on that. So at least with graphical effects, it worked, but I'm not sure custom OpenGL will work fine or not. Try it out.
Yeah, well, I can add to that there is a lot of videos on using OpenGL and Qt3D and together with QML on the KDAB YouTube channel. So there should definitely be more information there. And talking about the KDAB YouTube channel, we also have a lot of videos there from our own Pepe, who has been presenting Gamma Ray. So if you are interested in learning a bit more about Gamma Ray, that's a good start for you. Then I have a question here. I think it goes along the lines of Qt6. It says, do you know what strategy will be available in QtQuick Designer and Design Studio, given no JavaScript functions are allowed in .ui files?
I was actually talking to Nuno last week about this, and again, this is something I've not looked at, but I'm told that the Design Studio is much better at doing this, and probably there are support for calling JavaScript functions. There is hope because recently, I think there was 5.14, Qt 5.14 is when you could start calling basic JavaScript functions like this thing, math.min, or maybe earlier than that. But support has been added slowly. But I'm not sure what the future roadmap is. Yep.
Okay. I have a last question, which is really unfair to give you, given that we're talking about QML and you're not even the author, but I'll try you anyway. The question is, are there any plans to make Gamma Ray easier to use with Python binding? Do you have any insight in that?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Nope. I don't use Python with Qt a lot, so probably not even more than once in my life. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time and for trying to convince me with a QtQuick Designer.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for listening. Bye.
Bye.